know, human beings are very tribal. We get into our groups. And so if everybody's wearing the same thing, you sort of feel a part of that group. And so the only way to show resistance sometimes, especially since it was dangerous not to fly a Nazi flag or something, was to like wear makeup when you shouldn't, put on lipstick when you should be hopeless, and that makes you feel less hopeless.
On the mic with us today is Dr. Irene Guenther, historian, an award-winning professor,
and author of Nazi Chic, which won the prestigious Sierra Prize for Best History Book written by a female historian.
But it just made me understand again how powerful our expressive arts are, whether that's clothing or whether that's art.
In between working on various research papers and books, Irene teaches at the University of Houston's Honors College.
Changing the way we use that word. So usually when we think of fashion, just like in a superficial conversation, you're thinking things like Fashion Week or like the top models or whatever that might be. But it's also a verb to fashion oneself.
In our conversation, we dive deep into fashion history, revealing powerful ways fashion is able to manipulate mass perception. I'm your host, Ina Korobkina, founder of Jewel Branding Studios and creator of the Business in Style fashion course for entrepreneurs.
And I'm Ingrid J. Monday, aka Ms. Monday, a photographer and filmmaker and the author of the book, The Secrets of Becoming a Boss Bitch with a Heart of Gold.
Welcome to another episode of the Rise Up and Fix It podcast. Dr. Irene Guenther, welcome to our podcast. We're so happy to have you here with us today. I am a huge fan of your work. I first saw you in the Hugo Boss documentary for the Made to Measure channel years ago, which was loosely based on your award-winning book, Nazi Chic. And for our listeners, as a side note, that title comes with a question mark. In the documentary, you said, "What we wear is a poster of who we are." That quote resonated with me. It really caught my attention. And it has influenced a lot of my work, inspired a lot of my work as a stylist and an image consultant. So thank you for that inspiration. Before we dive into the deeper meaning behind this quote, can you tell our listeners what drew you to studying fashion history, and specifically during the Nazi-occupied Germany period? Your story is incredibly unique and fascinating, and I think our listeners would be interested to hear it.
Well, I could probably take up the whole podcast with my answer. But, essentially, I was a brand new single parent and thought I should go back to school. I was a professional singer for a long time. I sang blues and things like that. And I went back to school and I thought I should get like a quote normal job. So I tried accounting and then I tried business and like I hated both. And then I took an upper level history class that just blew me away because it was the first time I had taken a class where history was introduced as about people instead of about memorizing names and dates and things like that. Anyway, I just really took to it, and I ended up getting my undergraduate and my master's and then my PhD in cultural history. And originally my dissertation advisor wanted me to work on pop music in the Third Reich since I have this music background, but the music was horrible. It was so horrible. Like the Germans have no rhythm or something. I'm not quite sure, but I just thought I can't do this for 5 years because you usually work on a dissertation for a long time. But what I was interested in as I started flipping through family magazines and women's magazines in that period was this stunningly beautiful fashion that would appear on the pages of these German magazines. And I just assumed they were fashions out of Paris because I didn't even know Germany had a fashion industry. And then I learned that the fashion industry in Germany in the teens and 20s was their second largest export item. They made millions and millions of dollars off of what we call high-end ready-to-wear. So things you can buy off the rack at like a Neiman Marcus or some sort of, high-end store. And they shipped all over the world. I mean, that's really what they became known for. And it turns out that a lot of those designers of German ready-to-wear fashion were Jewish. And so that topic led me just into a rich journey into learning not only about the fashion industry and the thousands of people that comprise a fashion industry, from button makers and zipper makers to the actual designers and the manufacturers, but it also, of course, provided a really deep lens into how tight those relationships were between Germans and German Jews in the fashion industry, and how personal fashion really is, because it turns out it was the very last industry that the Nazis were able to Aryanize or to take over. Not until 2 weeks before World War II actually started was that industry finally Aryanized. And so it just seemed like the perfect topic to explore, because it opens up not just economic history and cultural history, but also, of course, German and German Jewish relationships, as well as, the most important lens, which is just how personal and powerful fashion can be, not just during an oppressive regime, but also, of course, during a war.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, most people would think, oh, fashion is pretty innocuous. It's at best fun and silly, but
Yeah.
it was one of the most powerful weapons the Nazis used. Can you explain to our listeners how they manipulated the masses and won them over to their way of thinking using such things as fashion, art, and film?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to me because art and other sort of cultural venues, but especially art, it seems to me, and film, were completely taken over by the Nazis. Um, I have a friend who focuses on film propaganda, for example. My father was an art historian, and he focused on the teens and 20s and 30s in art history in Germany. And so it's really clear that they could control those two cultural venues, because they came out with like a degenerate art exhibit. These are the art and the artists who are prohibited from painting. This is the art that's good. Same with film. Very, very controlled. And when it came to fashion, they tried that and it didn't work. So, what most people are familiar with are these photographs of German women with really wide hips, and they're wearing dirndl dresses, and there's papa music in the background, and that's sort of the picture we get of Nazi Germany, that they tried to push women to go backwards in their fashion to like this really cultural historical dress known as the dirndl dress, with an apron and puffy sleeves, things like that. And it was also clear, though, that most German women didn't want to wear that. And in particular, it was the Nazi officials' wives who refused to wear it. They continued to go to German Jewish fashion salons. They wanted to wear high-end fashion. They wanted to look stylish. And the second way in which clothing comes into importance is that the Nazis also pushed the sort of sports model, where women weren't supposed to wear any sort of makeup. They were supposed to look really athletic and powerful and fit. And the idea, of course, was to encourage them to have more babies. It wasn't to be sports fanatics. It was to encourage them to have babies. And then this third way in which the Nazis tried to present themselves was really to the outside world, which was this very modern, very stylized regime. And so almost all the officials' wives are wearing top designer fashions. And of course, that's going to trickle down to women in urban areas, especially. And so what you end up having is this real tension between like the posters of Nazi women wearing dirndl dresses and their parades and things like that. And then the actuality, which is, women who wanted to wear what was current and what was stylish and what they felt good in. And most interesting, it seems to me, is that even as the war goes on, it's the one area in which there are no prohibitions. So they tell women you shouldn't wear makeup, but they're wearing makeup, right? And they're telling women you should be wearing dirndl dresses, But in fact, they're not. That's not what they're doing. And so until the end of the war, there's no prohibitions against hair permanence. There's no prohibitions against cosmetics. I will say, of course, those things get harder and harder to attain as the war goes on because the chemicals are being used for the war factories. But overall, if you can get it, by God, that's what they wore. And I guess Ava Braun is one of the best models of that. She was Hitler's girlfriend. And, you know, after the war, when they got into where she was living, she had stashes of Elizabeth Arden cosmetics. She had closets and closets filled with fabulous clothes. Magda Goebbels was another one. So the propaganda minister's wife, same thing. Incredibly stylish, very up to date, lots of makeup, not at all what they were presenting to the masses. So it didn't work.
Interesting.
It's interesting. Well, there's the saying that things don't always appear to be what they are, right? When I think of Nazi Germany, I mean, I think we all think of war, power, pain, and also separation from love, right? And so they were trying to divide, but yet we were some way fighting back. But the reality was their agenda was also to get these soldiers interested in war and wearing these uniforms that were ultra chic, right? Like if you think of the German soldiers, I'm thinking of their uniforms. They looked powerful. They looked confident, right? But many of these soldiers were lied to. They didn't want to go to war. They wanted to stay home and have families. So to me, war goes against our nature, right? And how are we being brainwashed, or how are we being influenced, right? So when I think of politics and how they try to push fashion, you know, was it not, it was a sense of control, but it was also a sense of seduction, right? Maybe I'm not.
Absolutely.
Right?
Because to the outside world, they're showing, I mean, they even put together fashion shows in all the occupied countries. But none of the people in those countries could wear or buy fashion, right? It was trying to divert attention away from the catastrophe, right? And the horror of war and Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so if you can sort of glamorize war, it's the same with the men's uniform, since you brought that up. You know, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but they actually cut the jackets, the waists of the jackets of the SS higher than the actual waist to make the legs look longer on all the SS, right? Because that makes you look even more powerful and taller and more fit. And but it's also the sense of being tribal. You know, human beings are very tribal. We get into our groups. And so if everybody's wearing the same thing, you sort of feel a part of that group. And so the only way to show resistance sometimes, especially since it was dangerous not to fly a Nazi flag or something, was to like wear makeup when you shouldn't, put on lipstick when you should be hopeless, and that makes you feel less hopeless, right? There are all these ways in which fashion allows us to, in some ways, it seems to me, show defiance. I mean, the Ukrainians are putting on fashion shows as we speak. And when you find out why they're doing it, it's not just because they want to continue to produce and to create, but it's also a way of showing defiance. You're not going to kill our joy. You're not going to kill our cultural innovation. And so clothing, because it's so personal, allows us to do that, I think, in ways that other cultural formats don't.
Yeah, it's like a silent form of rebellion.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah. Now, as a historian, you've studied in depth 2 world wars. You have witnessed the horrors through the eyes of history, as well as moments of human connection, love, beauty, and creation. Can you share with our listeners some historical moments that stand out in your mind where fashion was able to lift up the human spirit? There are a couple of stories you mentioned in our phone call that really like sparked me. I'm like, our listeners need to hear these stories.
Oh, gosh, there's a lot of them. There's one woman, um, she was Jewish, but she was also in the political resistance, and she was captured, and she writes about the fact that what she does to keep her dignity in the concentration camp is to stay up after everybody else, falls asleep on their bunks. And she washes this one piece of underwear that she's allowed to have. It's really just more of a rag, as she describes it. And she sets it out to dry so it'll be clean in the morning. And it's her way of sort of defying the Nazis' attempt to make her feel less than human, even though it's just a pair of underwear that only she can see. It still was clearly an act of defiance, and also very courageous, because had they have caught her doing that, I'm sure there would have been a terrible price to pay. But even on the home fronts, there's some remarkable stories, and I certainly don't want to portray the German women as being, all of them resistors, but there were ways in which sometimes they resisted. There's one woman who took sugar sacks, and she unraveled the sugar sacks to crochet underwear and a little vest, for example, for her family. There's others who relate stories of standing in line for hours and hours and hours just to get newspaper, and out of the newspaper they'd make hats. And you and I would think newspaper hats, that's weird, but it was simply a way of showing individuality and sort of resistance against those really, really catastrophic times. Um, you and I talked in the telephone conversation, and it rang a bell with you that certainly in the 30s in Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, people would stand in line for hours and hours and hours for a tube of lipstick or a pair of pantyhose. And the same, of course, in the 70s and 80s again. Some author that I read said that she would stock up on all of that, and when she'd visit her friends in the Soviet Union, they were just like kids at Christmas time when she would pass out tubes of lipstick, because it made them feel so much better in such bleak and defiant times. But I think the quote that always really stuck with me was in the civil war in Lebanon in the 70s and early 80s. There was a television reporter who had one of the most popular shows. It was like a fashion show, but it was French fashion for Lebanese audiences. And she said, when asked why her show was so popular, fashion is like a flower in a vase. It helps you forget the horrors of yesterday and cope with tomorrow.
It's a beautiful quote.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it probably resonates with most of us who've been through really tough times,
Gosh, wow. I think when I think about even post-war, right? It's fascinating to see how fashion changed. Like the pro-peace mindset, brought many changes too. Like there was a lot of things like, flowers, bright colors, even nudity, right? Like less clothes. And so I'm curious to hear your opinion on this. Like you mentioned that fashion was important during war, right? And how it brought us, or putting on lipstick gave us sense of power, right? But I'm also curious to think about the post-war period, because it brought us back to our roots, maybe, I don't know.
I know in the post-war period, because I've been working on that quite a bit, within 4 months, there were already fashion shows literally in basements filled with rubble in Berlin, for example. And one of the big innovations was called the Flickenkleid. And what it really means is a patchwork dress. And because there was no material, there was no elastic, there was like nothing like that, women would sew together from patches of, blown apart curtains or tablecloths or, old uniforms that had been discarded or whatever it might be. They would patch together almost like we would a quilt, enough material to sew a dress. I know that a lot of them, for example, had their dead husbands' uniform jackets, and from those they would make new jackets for their kids or for themselves. For example, the Allied occupiers had rules that they would have to dye the material so it wouldn't look like the old uniforms. So they'd go out into the woods and collect ivy leaves or whatever might dye the fabric a different color. But probably one of the most remarkable immediate post-war stories that I learned about in an interview was one of the Jewish survivors who I interviewed. She said that as the Allies were liberating camps, in the camp that she was in, the women who were still surviving, they went to the headquarters, to the office there at the concentration camp, and they tore the curtains off the windows. And she made herself a dress from those curtains. She called it her victory dress. And
Oh, wow.
when I interviewed her in the early 2000s, she was already in her late 80s, and she still had that dress, of course, pulled it out from underneath her bed to show me this, very thin fabric by that time, of course, but it meant so much to her. And it reminded me, in the middle of all the academic research I was doing, just how deeply personal we invest ourselves into the clothing that we wear, right?
That's interesting that you say that, because we're living in a world now where clothing ends up in the landfill very, very quickly.
That's
And so we don't have that opportunity to build that relationship with the clothing in our closet. And going back to your quote, what we wear is a poster of what we are. What does it say about us and our society right now, where we don't have that special connection and that history? It doesn't become part of our second skin. It's very sad, I think.
Yeah. We could choose differently,
We
right?
could.
We could absolutely choose differently. I have a couple of things. One of them I got at a flea market in Berlin. It's a vest, and I know that it's from the early 40s. And of course, it means the world to me, not just because it represents some of the work that I've done, but I was able, because there was a label in it, to track down the family of the person who actually owned the vest, right? And so when I wear it, other people don't know the history of that, but I know it, right? And so it feels so special to me when I wear it. But there's a couple of other things, like a sweater that my mother knitted me when I was pregnant with my first child, for example. Like that sweater, even though it's got holes in it and things, like I won't ever get rid of that sweater. So there are things that I think we could do to sort of push against this notion that we always have to have new, and it always has to be different, and it has to be season to season. And a lot of times it gets people in terrible credit card debt. But I think it also, when it sort of pushes, you have to have something new. People aren't taking the time to figure out who they are, what poster they want to construct, what story they want to tell the outside world. Instead, they're just wearing what they think they're supposed to wear.
Yeah, I agree with that. My theory is that we have lost touch with our fashion stories.
Yeah.
So like, and this has been part of my journey as a stylist and someone who truly loves fashion, is that I didn't grow up with fashion stories. Growing up partly under the communist regime, wearing Soviet school uniform, then coming to North America when I was 10, my mom didn't have fashion stories to share with me because she grew up under the communist regime. She didn't discover her authentic style, so she couldn't kind of guide me. And I think we are living in a world where we need these stories in order to be inspired to find our style journey. And that's why I created the journal that I shared with you, and which I feature your quote in, because it has been such a big part of my inspiration, sharing stories, fashion stories.
No, I agree with you completely. I just wonder why it seems to be so hard for people to push against this notion that it always has to be new and it has to be what shows up in the magazines. I mean, I guess I understand that the industry is always trying to innovate, and because it's always trying to make money, right? But there's something so important to understanding who you are, and one way we figure that out and your book is so good at, I think, is trying to figure out, okay, what am I wearing that makes me feel really good or that tells my story in a way that just by looking at me, you can sort of begin to guess what's underneath that clothing, right?
It's an opportunity to express yourself. Like it speaks for you before you speak.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's this fight between being wanting to be an individual and expressing our individuality, but also wanting to fit in. And how do we find that middle ground? So, yeah, it's I guess part of the journey. How did you discover your authentic style? Because I think you were an immigrant as well, right? You grew up, you
Yes.
moved to the United States as a
Yeah.
child, or your parents brought you?
Yeah, no, we moved here when I was, my sisters and I were fairly young. We were unbelievably poor. My father had a PhD, but they wouldn't accept it at the time. Now, of course, they do, but back then they didn't accept foreign PhDs. So he had to work at a lumber dock in San Antonio while he got a new PhD, an American PhD. And then he started teaching courses at night at the Whitty Museum in San Antonio, and immediately, of course, got his fans. He was just a terrific lecturer and art historian, as I said, and eventually would found the art department at the University of Houston. But I mean, I didn't even, this is embarrassing to say, I suppose, on a national podcast, but I didn't even have my, like a pedicure or manicure till I was in my 30s. It didn't dawn on me that I could even afford that because we didn't, I mean, we were really poor. But I think I mentioned to you in our phone conversation, I, my mother was gorgeous. She was so stylish. I thought, at least as a kid, I thought, oh my God, she's just beautiful. Everything was handmade. She even made her own belts. And I have pictures of her that to this day she's just stunning. So I guess what I tried to figure out was how is she doing what she's doing, right? With as little as we had at the time. And the biggest lesson I learned from that was it doesn't require a lot of money. It's not like
Yeah.
we have to spend $1,000 for that pair of boots or that belt or that dress. It has to do with how the clothing we're wearing makes us feel. And I think we've
Yeah.
sort of lost touch with that. And that's why I go back to these war stories, because it's so clear to me that that newspaper hat or that little vest made out of sugar sacks, for example, like that must have made them feel better because it was a lot of work. They're doing it by candlelight because they don't have electricity because they've been bombed, right? So like they're living in rubble the last year or so of the war, and the same with the French for that matter.
Yeah.
You know, in occupied France, especially the last year and a half, nobody's producing fashion per se. Some of the houses continue to because they're collaborating, but for the most part, people are just making do with what they have. But it's remarkable to me what they're making to make do, if that makes sense.
It's like a
Yeah.
glimmer of hope, a
Yeah.
feeling, having respect for those pieces,
Yeah.
you know, but we've lost it. And I hope that, we can inspire the youth and they can, look at their closet and think, hey, what is fashion really? What is it? And how is it impacting us? And,
I
you
think
know,
changing the way we use that word. So usually when we think of fashion, just like in a superficial conversation, you're thinking things like fashion week or like the top models or whatever that might be. But it's also a verb to fashion oneself, right? Which sort of peels away some of that unattainable power we think the word fashion has. We can fashion ourselves the way we want to without trying to aspire to, some of the fashion that's shown in Fashion Week, for example, or on the pages of glossy magazines. I mean, that was one of the big problems that the Nazis wrestled with so much during the war is bombs are falling everywhere. And by 1943, they're clearly beginning to lose the war. And at the same time, they're publishing these glossy magazines, not for the home front, because they're running out of paper. They're sending them to the occupied territories, like France, for example. There's one propaganda magazine called Signal, and it's specific for like the French and the Netherlands and some of those occupied countries, and they're filled with like glossy fashion pictures. Who are they kidding, right? Like the average woman knows this is ridiculous. This is not the world we're living in. And so they take it upon themselves to construct their own fashion. And so if we think of it that way, that it's not just, what the top models are wearing, but it's a verb, a way in which we can actually fashion ourselves, I think it might take some of the weight off of that word.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like we like to talk about stories and how they have the power to heal, but stories can also have the power to influence and control the mind. And in that case, it's not a healing story; it's a form of propaganda.
Yeah.
So in with these fashion magazines, it's a clear example of propaganda. Now, you also studied the anti-war art of German expressionists. How did these artists express themselves during this period to win over the hearts and minds of people with their anti-war message?
Really, really difficult. As I said, the art world was far more controlled when the Nazis took over than fashion was. I just know from personal experience, as well as some of the artists that I researched, that most of them lost their jobs. If they were professors at an art academy, for example, they lost their jobs. Their paintings were not allowed to be exhibited. There was a brief period, of course, in the early 1920s when a lot of the artists who had served in World War I, who had survived, did a lot of anti-war art. So some of your listeners would be familiar with Otto Dix, for example, or George Gross, Käthe Kollwitz, some of those. The artist that I studied, the postcard artist who sent his fiance, his beloved, from these military field cards, he painted each one of them and sent them back to their hometown in Dresden. He would become a pretty strong anti-war artist as well in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, they're prohibited from exhibiting. Sometimes they're even visited by the SS to check to see if their paintbrushes are wet or not. So a lot of it has to go underground. And so for the anti-war art of the 1920s, meaning against war because of World War I, some of those survived the bombing of World War II, but of course a lot of them were either destroyed by the Nazis or they were destroyed in the war.
Oh,
Wow.
so sad.
Wow.
But you mentioned the postcards, so that was your second book that you wrote, and you sent me an article, and I saw some images of these postcards. They're absolutely stunning. The detail is incredible, and it really touches the heart. Like there's sketches, but it just is really powerful. The story behind how you came across these postcards is very fascinating. Can you share with our listeners how that happened?
Sure. So my father had been sick for quite a while and he passed away. And just a few weeks later, my mother died. And there was nothing wrong with her. She didn't want to be here anymore. And of course, it just broke my heart. And I was the sister tasked with sort of taking apart their home that they'd lived in for a long time. And because I'm the only one that kept up with German, I'm still really fluent in German because of my scholarship and research. It was most appropriate that I go through all of his art history things. And on the very last day that I was at the house before we were going to sell it, I was just checking. He had a huge library, floor to ceiling bookshelves and so on. And I got on a ladder just to make sure that I hadn't missed anything on the top shelf of the bookshelf, because they had this habit of writing notes to each other and putting them in books, like make sure you read this or make sure you read that, or chapter 3 is wonderful. I even found a few of these post-its to me would fall out of these books as I went through them, right? So I'm on the top rung. It's really late at night. I'm exhausted. and emotionally exhausted too, for sure. And so I'm just sort of patting the top shelf with my hand because it's right against the ceiling, so it's too high for me to actually see. And I feel something, and I pull it out, and it's a brown envelope, just your regular 8.5 by 11, very clearly old brown envelope. And so I pull it down. I finish patting the top shelf. That's all that's up there. And I pull out the content, and it looks like postcards to me, but it's like 2:30 in the morning. I'm tired, and I'm thinking, I'll look at it tomorrow. At one point, I even thought I ought to just toss it. Thank God I didn't. So I get home, and I guess I'm still all worked up. So I decide not to go to bed, and I pull them out again, and I realize, oh my gosh, these are hand painted postcards from 1915. So 100 years old. They're in perfect shape. They're all, so for your listeners, they're just 4 by 6 inch cards. Um, all of the belligerents, everybody fighting on every side of the war in World War I, their militaries would give soldiers these blank postcards, and that's how they wrote back to their families. And the reason why they did postcards was because they could censor them easily. They didn't have to open an envelope. They could just look at the postcard, see if it says anything anti-war, and if it didn't, on it went to the home front. But what this person did, his name was Otto Schubert, was he painted, as Inna said, he painted these scenes that he was experiencing on the Western Front. And only on the very, very tiny edge of the postcard would he write. And it always started Liebe Irma, so dear Irma, and it always ended with 1,000 greetings, your Otto. And usually it was just very mundane things like, dear Irma, please send more cigarettes, or dear Irma, hot day on the front, something like that. Altogether, there were almost 90 of them. They were just exquisitely painted. So it was clear to me this person was trained as a painter, but I didn't know who he was. I'd never heard of this artist, which seemed weird to me that I wouldn't have heard of him. But anyway, 8 years later, I learned through much research that he survives the war. He's shot very badly at Verdun. Somehow his buddies help pull him off the battlefield, and he's brought to a field hospital, and then from there transported back to Dresden. So he's one of the few lucky ones who survived the Battle of Verdun. They end up getting married. They have 3 children. He's a rising artist in the 20s. He does a lot of anti-war stuff. And in fact, you can see it at the LA County Museum, the big Los Angeles museum that has a huge section of German Expressionist art. For your listeners who are interested, you can also see it online. And then the Nazis take over. He's prohibited from painting, and his wife will die in the bombing of Dresden in the Second World War. His son will die on the Russian front in the Second World War. His 2 daughters escape to England. And decades later, I've written this book, and the BBC does an interview with me, which airs all over Europe. And 2 days later, I get an email from his grandson who said he heard this interview. He had no idea that his grandfather had done all of this. And since then, of course, we've kept in touch. But it just made me understand again how powerful our expressive arts are, whether that's clothing or whether that's art. I mean, you think about it, 4 by 6 inch postcards survived 2 world wars, the Cold War, because Schubert ends up in Dresden, which is East Germany, as you know, and spends the rest of his life in East Germany, stuck behind the wall. Nobody in the West knows about his art. And so it's almost like this message from 100 years ago that I discovered, right? Resilience and hope and the creative spirit and this notion that somehow they'll be together again.
Yeah, the love. I got goosebumps. Like, you've said the story before, but hearing it again is, yeah, so magical.
Yeah.
For our listeners who are unfamiliar with the title of your book, I think it was Postcards from the Trenches, a
Yeah.
German soldier's testimony of the Great War. And it's available online and you can buy it now.
Yeah.
Who's
And
interested?
I would recommend it not for book sales, but because the publisher very kindly, it's Bloomsbury Publisher, who does such a great job with cultural books, because they allowed dozens of reproductions. They reproduced all 90 of the postcards, and we have translations of them. And then they also allowed me to reproduce dozens of his work that we discovered in East German warehouses, um, that, of course, were available once the wall came down. So, um, so it's just sort of a compendium of all of the work that he did, both after World War One and then again after World War Two. Just remarkable. And 5 of the postcards were included in the recent exhibit at the LA County Museum on the Great War in Modern Media.
Wow.
For those of you who love art and are listening, I would highly recommend it just because of the pictures. They're fabulous.
Yeah, amazing. It's so wonderful to see that the work that you do as a historian to continue these stories. Like if you didn't find those postcards and
I,
if you didn't write a book, like we wouldn't know. Like I think historians are so important, and I'm so glad that you are teaching and researching and writing these books and influencing the world in the way that you do with the things that you love to do. And with history, with certain moments in history, there was a pushback on teaching the art of style at schools and to women because there was a certain movement, a certain school of thought that said that it was not important, that it, in a way, diminished femininity or diminished what a woman was, that we were more than just what we were wearing. We were more than just a dress. It is it's our second skin. It is a form of expression. So in the 1960s is when this school of thought began to take shape, and garments became basically shapeless. And lost all that beautiful detail that they had earlier in fashion history. There were so many different interesting collars and sleeves and detail to clothing, and we started to slowly lose that. And it's what brought us to where we are today, where a lot of people are just relying on sweatpants and crop tops. I hate to be one of those, like, in my day, I never wore that. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, we are a poster. What we wear is a poster of who we are.
yeah, I mean, the pandemic made that very clear, right? Because I had to teach over Zoom, and I didn't even know what Zoom was. You know, I'm teaching 5 classes. We had 1 week. We were told by the university, you have 1 week to switch over to Zoom. And my classes are really interactive, and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this, right? And so the first few days, of course, were sort of hit and miss. But what was so interesting to me, and what always broke the ice, was, all you could see in a Zoom box is like the person's face. And some of the students, of course, would even turn off their videos, which I insisted they could not do, so that at least we could see each other in these little boxes. But what we would explore is what we were wearing on the bottom, right? Because that, see, did they just roll out of bed? Like, what are they? And by the end of that semester, when everybody by that time felt really comfortable with each other in our Zoom class, one of my students was defending his thesis, and he had this beautiful like jacket on, tie, looked really, really good, and on the bottom he was wearing his pajama pants, right? So it seems to me the pandemic, encouraged what you were just saying, which is like loose, baggy pants. Like, it's like if you have to sit all day and work, and you've got this little window where all they can see is your face. Like, who cares what you're wearing on the bottom?
That was the poster, the COVID fashion poster.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I
Oh my
think we're
goodness.
finally getting away from that a little bit. But I guess what I worry about is like, I've told you before, I use social media because I have too many former and current students. I would just like feel overwhelmed. But I do try to sort of keep up a little bit here and there. So I'll flip through magazines and things like that. And it's always about, I mean, it's just weird. Like, do you want to wear what Taylor Swift wears? This is where you buy it, or this is how you, and I don't like, I don't like that. It's encouraging us to be, to copy someone that we're not. When in fact, if you really think about fashioning oneself, it is about constructing both an identity that you feel comfortable with, right? Oh, clothes, that feeling of like something that fits you so well, but it's also a way of projecting who you want the world to think you are.
Yeah. Well, this was such a wonderful conversation. We went in so many different directions. I think our audience are going to find a lot of value in all the stories that you shared today.
Well, Irene, thank you so much for being part of our podcast today. What an engaging conversation. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights in the significant role that fashion in our history and how it shapes our identity. Your perspectives today have certainly prompted us to consider the impact of fashion on our lives and how it played part in our history. Definitely. Your valuable contribution is much appreciated. And so thank you. And we eagerly anticipate your next project, your next exciting development, and your future research. So thank you so much for being on our show, Irene. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed our interview today, please share and like it.
And if you have a unique story on how you are creatively engaging with the world, we can help you share it in a multitude of different ways. We are experts in crafting stunning photos, videos, and compelling narratives. Our mission is to make you and your brand stand out.
Please visit our website, www.riseupandfixit.com, to learn more and to connect with us.